We've seen how aircraft have been developed by the military into a formidable weapon. But there is another use, one that the military hold just as important, but perhaps not as glamorous for the pilots. The use of aircraft to transport supplies, troops, and equipment wherever necessary, not only in times of war, but also in peacetime.
Until well into the 1920s, there were hardly any operating military transport aircraft. And those that did exist were converted bombers, used for opening up pioneer air routes or conveying statesmen to peace conferences. One of the RAF's earliest types was the Vernon, which was followed by the Victoria and the Valentia. Each of these seated about 17 equipped troops. As early as 1923, American service pilots had managed to refuel each other in flight. But this method of extending range or endurance didn't become an operational method until after World War II. Today, one of the most important roles of the transport aircraft is that of an in-flight refueling tanker.
07 is on the port.
0719, roger. You're clear astern the port hose.
07, roger. To the port hose.
Zero 0719, ready for contact port.
07, roger. Closing up.
Am I clear?
The most numerous transport aircraft of World War II was the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a derivative of the civilian DC-3 airliner. But in post-war years, military transport made great strides. After the C-47, Douglas built the C-124 Globemaster, with seating for up to 200 troops and huge clamshell nose doors. But before this aircraft appeared, Lockheed brought in the C-130 Hercules, and for over 40 years, this aircraft's been the backbone of leading military transport, and unbelievably, is still in production today. The Lockheed Hercules was built in response to a US specification for a large transport plane that could carry 90 or more fully equipped ground troops, 17 tons of equipment, and could take off and land in the shortest possible runway space. The C-130 Hercules exceeded all of these requirements with ease and became one of the most versatile military transport types ever produced. One of the giant transport aircraft is the C-5A Galaxy, which can carry a staggering 120 tons of cargo in its hold. The 1985 Paris Air Show revealed an even bigger monster of an aeroplane. The Russian AN-124, with a payload of 150 tons. Today's military transport planes fill a variety of roles. They're used to support the ground troops, dropping supplies into difficult terrain. They carry troops all over the globe. They act as hospital ships or airborne ambulances. In fact, whatever the payload, whether it be cargo, supplies or people, today's military transport aircraft provide the means necessary to service even the most remote or distant military outposts.
Keep straight.
Today's modern transport aircraft not only fulfill a vital role in military and wartime use, they also have an important part to play in flying relief missions to famine and disaster areas.
The introduction of the turbojet engine towards the end of World War II came at a time when great effort was being made by both sides to channel this new invention into fighter aircraft. As events transpired, neither side was to bring the first jet fighters into any significant service until the war was virtually over. After hostilities ceased, engine designers had more time to concentrate on other future possibilities for both military and civil aircraft using jet engines. Even the very earliest could develop a thrust capable of lifting their own weight. So, an obvious application was the possibility of an aircraft that could take off vertically.
To evaluate the feasibility of controlling such a contraption, Rolls-Royce mounted two Nene engines horizontally in a tubular steel engine testbed and modified the engine tailpipes to direct the jet efflux vertically downwards. When it first flew in 1953, the four-legged framework created a worldwide sensation and was promptly dubbed the Flying Bedstead. The first use made of this development was by Short Brothers and Harland with the SC-1 Delta research aircraft. The SC-1 became the world's first VTOL aircraft to achieve vertical takeoff in 1958. In 1960, the aircraft achieved not only vertical takeoff, but also hovered, then flew in forward flight, then back to hover. There had been attempts throughout the world at VTOL aircraft. Some of the not-so-well-known designs can be seen here. At around the same time as Short's development in vertical lift, there was another aircraft manufacturer working on a similar project. Hawker were building a different design known as vectored thrust. This system was tested in the Hawker P1127.
I was fortunate enough to spend the last 7 years of my test flying career doing much of the pioneering development work on the vertical takeoff aeroplanes produced under the umbrella of Sir Sidney Cam, namely the Hawker P1127, the Kestrel, and then the Harrier. I saw them from the sparkle in the designer's eye right through to the aircraft going into operational purpose.
The aircraft had tethers at the wingtips and at the tail, allowing it initially to go to 1 foot in altitude and later on to about 4 feet before we did the free hovering on the airplane.
1 month before I was due to fly the prototype, someone drove me into a tree in Germany, smashed my ankle. I finished up with a medical category unique in aviation history of fit civil test pilot, tethered hovering only.
The first prototype was a success. This was soon followed by a second prototype. However, although the tests proved the potential of vertical lift, things didn't always go to plan. Sometimes they went drastically wrong. By 1964, the aircraft had achieved supersonic speed in a shallow, low dive. In the same year, an operational RAF squadron took delivery of the Kestrel military version for tests and evaluation. The team consisted of 4 RAF pilots, 1 US Air Force, 1 US Navy, 2 US Army, and also 2 Luftwaffe pilots.
This machine filled us all with immense enthusiasm, unbelievable technical problems. We did manage to operate it from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal on the 8th of February 1963. There were lots of skeptical comments about it because the Navy wanted to keep the big ships conventional air power. The government said out with big aircraft carriers. So we wanted to prove the role of the airplane, and indeed we did. And afterwards the Flag Officer Aircraft Carrier Admiral Sir Donald Gibson said to me, "Bill, the thing that impressed me most is the complete absence of fright on the part of the spectators. New aircraft normally come aboard bigger, heavier and faster, but here was a complete reversal of the trend."
The successful testing led to the introduction of the Hawker Harrier GR1, which entered service with the RAF on the 1st of April 1969. The RAF Harriers were later upgraded to the GR3 and later to the GR5. There was also a variant designed for the Royal Navy, the Sea Harrier FRS-1. Delivered to the Navy in 1979, the Sea Harrier takes off from the carrier deck using a ski ramp without catapult assistance, and then lands vertically without a rest gear. The ultimate test for the Harriers and Sea Harriers came in 1982, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. Operating from the carriers HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes, the Sea Harriers destroyed a total of 28 enemy aircraft, with no loss of their own aircraft in air combat. There have been other attempts at vertical takeoff aircraft, including different variants of the Harrier built under license by Douglas for the US Marine Corps, the AV-8Bs. These heavier versions could carry more fuel and weaponry and had advanced avionics and equipment. The Hawker version of this variant became the Harrier GR7. In May 1969, 2 Harrier GR1s from the Harrier Conversion Unit took part in and won the Daily Mail Transatlantic Air Race, flying 3,500 miles from the Post Office Tower in London to the Empire State Building in New York. One Harrier, piloted by Royal Navy pilot Brian Davis, set the fastest eastbound time of 5 hours and 49 minutes, while the second was piloted by squadron leader Lecky Thompson.
The air race, of course, I'll never forget. Mainly the time it took to leave from the top of the GPO tower to lift off at St Pancras. That only took 6 minutes 50 seconds. And then the acceleration, climb out to St Pancras up to 36,000 feet and meeting up with the tanker over Boscombe Down, Wiltshire. Leaving the GPO tower at 10 o'clock in the morning, I was in contact with the tankers taking on fuel at 10 past 10 at 36,000. And some 6 hours later, I was landing in New York on East River, 5 hours, 57 minutes later. So that was something in my memory I'll never forget. first appeared on the scene, the general reaction was one of total disbelief. In particular in America, when we went across there to try and get permission to fly the Harrier for the air race, they just would not believe that we had such an aeroplane. And if it hadn't been for the air race, I don't think they would still be believing it. But of course, we took it there, showed them exactly what the aircraft could do.
And the rest was part of aviation history.
In the early days of flight, every aircraft was considered unusual. But as time went on and developments were made and new standards achieved, aircraft became part of modern-day life. But even then, and indeed even now, there were still some aircraft that were completely unique. Designs and prototypes that manufacturers had constructed to push the boundaries of flight just that bit extra.
The North American X-15. Dropped from its pod under the fuselage of a B-52 bomber, the X-15 achieved speeds of Mach 6.7 in October 1967. This aircraft literally flew on the edge of space, an incredible 67 miles high, and is still, even today, the fastest aircraft ever built. Today, Northrop is best known for its revolutionary B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. But 50 years ago, the company came close to building another flying wing bomber. The XB-49. Similar in size and shape to the new stealth B-2, this aircraft was designed for reconnaissance. Unfortunately, for monetary reasons, the aircraft never made it onto the production line. On October the 14th, 1947, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager flew the experimental Bell X-1. The purpose was to explore the problems of what had become known as the sonic wall, or the sound barrier. In World War II, pilots in fighter aircraft had experienced strange and alarming behavior of their machines when in a high-speed dive. In some cases, losing complete control, with the wings tearing off and the aircraft breaking apart. The rocket-powered Bell X-1, dropped from underneath a bomber at 43,000 feet, reached speeds of 700 miles an hour. Chuck Yeager thereby setting his place in the annals of aviation history by becoming the first man to fly beyond the speed of sound. On the 13th of June 1979, a most peculiar aircraft took to the air. An aircraft that would have been more suited to the earlier pioneers like Blériot and the Wright brothers. But this was an aviation first, when Brian Allen took 2 hours and 49 minutes to complete the first man-powered flight across the English Channel. The Gossamer Albatross was pedal-powered. The The legendary recluse billionaire Howard Hughes was also an intrepid builder of aircraft. When the Hughes Spruce Goose took off from New York Harbor in November 1947, it was the largest aircraft ever built. Even today, this monster of a seaplane still holds the record for being the aircraft with the world's largest wingspan. The North American Twin Mustang. This World War II fighter was actually two Mustang fuselages and cockpits, joined together by one wing. The pilot sat in one, whilst the co-pilot navigator was in the other. This peculiar aircraft is the world's smallest ever built and flown. The Bumblebee, built by Robert H. Starr, was so called because, according to all of the laws of avionics, its wingspan was too small for its weight ratio to produce lift, just as it is with a Bumblebee. A road-going car that was designed and built in the USA in the 1950s. But a car with a difference. By strapping on a wing and adding a propeller to the rear, this car could, and still does in fact, fly.
We have shown you how, from the very first nucleus of an idea that man could fly, aircraft have become one of the most important weapons of any military force. But the aeroplane has another very significant use, and the development of aircraft to carry passengers safely, in significant numbers, has been one of the greatest success stories in the history of aviation. The official time that Charles A. Lindbergh took to fly from New York to Paris in 1927 was 33 hours and 30 minutes. He achieved this in an act of sheer endurance, intelligence, and willpower. Today, the same journey takes just a few hours. No more willpower or intelligence is needed other than to purchase a ticket and pack a bag. Commercial air travel is something we now take for granted, and the most a modern-day air traveler has to cope with on a journey across the Atlantic is boredom.
In the first decade of this century, on the 16th of November 1909, the world's first airline was founded. This was the Deutsche Luftschiffahrts AG, a German company with its headquarters in Frankfurt. They operated passenger flights with Zeppelin airships. On the 19th of June 1910, the first of the airships made its maiden voyage and became the first powered aircraft to carry passengers. The story of the commercial airlines had begun.
In 1918, an airmail flight was made from New York to Washington. Most of those early airmail pilots were World War I flyers who wanted to carry on their love affair with the plane. Others became barnstormers and stunt flyers. The West and all America were catching the aviation bug in a big way, and in a crazy way. Crowds thrilled to all kinds of aerial acrobatics. Airborne tennis, anyone? Airmail flying wasn't safer.
The very first commercial aircraft were used to carry mail both in the USA and in Europe. But very soon they were also to carry single passengers, and very soon new airlines were springing up around the globe. It needed courage to fly in these open planes. Passengers had to wear special clothing to protect them against the wind and the weather. Comfort was the last consideration. It's no wonder that flying was then considered to be something of a foolhardy business. Nevertheless, the people that needed things moved in a hurry, such as the postal services and newspapers, all supported the airlines. All over Europe, airlines were soon operating scheduled services, as seen here with the Holland-England Express. Flying was an adventurous business in those early days, yet as new routes were opened and pioneered, passengers soon began to see the benefits of air transport. The airline business was growing rapidly, along with the development of new aircraft. Aircraft like the new Fokker F-2, which was one of the first new aircraft that had reasonable comfort for the passengers. The Fokker F-2 was a great success, especially with the Dutch airline KLM, which used it on routes from Amsterdam to London, Bremen and Hamburg.
Father is waved off by his whole family. He is a hero. Just one more cigarette. The pilot, in his thick layers of clothing, hoists himself into the open cockpit. A last kiss. A handshake, and the flight can leave.
As new routes were opened, new aircraft came online, with even more added comfort for the passenger, now capable of taking 4 passengers in heated cabins. From year to year, the network of air routes expanded, flying all over Europe, the USA, and even to more inaccessible places where no roads or railway lines even existed. Asia, South America, the open wastelands of Russia. The aeroplane and commercial air travel was rapidly expanding. Passengers and baggage had to be weighed before takeoff. With single-engined planes, even the weight of a newspaper could be decisive. Airlines now employed larger numbers of employees, not only the pilots, but also the ground crews and engineers. Faster aircraft were being produced with ever increasingly more powerful engines. New airstrips were built, new terminals. Very soon, the smaller airlines were beginning to amalgamate, forming much larger corporations. Airline and passenger travel had become big business.
1925. Congress passed the first Airmail Act, or Kelly Bill, transferring this dangerous airmail business to private contractors. A transcontinental airmail service was established. Route 4, from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City via Las Vegas. Route 4 was awarded to Western Air Express. There were kisses for the pilots. A big letter from the Los Angeles mayor to the mayor of New York had its picture taken too. Wonder where that was stowed. All kinds of excitement. The cameras of Pathé Newsreel told the story of the West's big day in this way.
In the USA, with new airlines opening up all over the continent, the US mail service was sometimes a risky business.
Well, we followed what we call the Iron Compass. And that was the railroad track, Union Pacific, that happened to be right almost on our route. And when the weather was bad and when the weather was good, we stayed on our own side, the right-hand side, to keep from running into each other. A lot of times we passed in the storm and didn't see each other. We had a dairy, and he told my dad, he says, you keep that kid from flying that mail over my dairy because I'm going to have buttermilk in my stuff instead of milk to go to the creamery.
This was the very first US airline ticket, Western Air Express's passenger number 1.
There was someone get on the airplane and decide that they ought to have their feet on the ground, so I had a cigar box under my seat with some soil in it, and I'd say, all right, if you feel like you're nervous and you want your feet on the ground, use this cigar box. Put your feet in there.
As the business expanded, so too did the fleets of aircraft. Much larger types came into service, capable of carrying more fuel to reach even further destinations. New terminals were constructed with passenger lounges and check-in facilities. Flying was no longer the risky and uncomfortable way to travel that it had been a decade before. For the pilot, however, it was a different story. On some aircraft, they still flew in open cockpits, navigating by sight and dead reckoning, following rail tracks and roads. But as flying became more sophisticated, so too did the developments of electronic flying aids and radio communications. All services were operated mainly in the daytime only. And in the bad weather of the winter months, flights did not always run to schedule, nor did they fly at night. That was not until 1926 when illuminated flight paths came into operation with rotating beacons every few kilometers. On May the 1st that year, at 2 a.m. in the morning, a Junkers Ju-24 took off from Berlin on the world's first night flight with passengers. Reached its destination in Königsburg, and the passengers were switched to a connecting flight en route to Moscow. Total travelling time was 18 hours, compared to the railway journey, which took over 70 hours. Once again, the advantages of flying were clear. Airline travel was becoming more and more reliable. In Europe, most major cities were now only a few hours away. The aircraft were comfortable, with ever-increasing onboard luxury and service. Meteorological information was improved. Radio communication was being introduced for route navigation, expanding the routes and networks over ever-increasing distances. In poor weather conditions, unable to see a view of the landscape, the airmen had to rely on their instrument panel to navigate. there was more advanced training for the pilots and navigators, enabling them to operate in bad weather. Instrument flying was now commonplace. And with the introduction of more sophisticated airport lighting, airlines could now operate safer and more reliable schedules in poor weather and, of course, at night. With the ever-increasing development of airline travel, the world was becoming an ever-decreasingly smaller place. Journeys that would have previously taken many weeks of ocean travel were now being covered in a matter of days. The new breed of airliner was now capable of taking 15 passengers or more. One airline that was a real pioneer of commercial passenger services was the American company Pan Am.
The story begins here at Key West, Florida. A tiny new airline called Pan American Airways, with 2 tri-motor airplanes, a contract to fly mail on a 90-mile route to Havana, and a boundless faith in the future of air travel, takes off. In 1928, Pan Am carries 1,100 passengers between Florida and Cuba. It extends its route southward to Haiti and San Juan, to Mexico City and Panama, to Colombia on the South American continent. As it would do so many times in the future, Pan Am orders new aircraft built to its own specifications. The Sikorsky S-38, an amphibian that could take people where there were no airports. The first commercial 4-engine aircraft, Pan Am's Sikorsky S-40 flying boat. Pan Am's network expands until it covers the Caribbean and all of Central and South America. Air bases are built, carved out of jungles, hacked out of volcanic rock. Radio and weather stations are constructed. In its first 5 years, Pan Am opens 18,000 miles of airways linking 27 countries. Pan Am now knows far more than any other airline about long-range, over-water flying. Latin America has provided a laboratory where Pan Am could develop the techniques and equipment and train the personnel which will enable it to take on far greater challenges. And a very great challenge is about to present itself. The Pacific. In the early 1930s, the only way to cross it is by ship, a journey that takes weeks. No airline has dared to even think about flying across it. Until Pan Am. In November 1935, the Martin 130 China Clipper, a plane Pan Am helped design, takes off from San Francisco. Its destination, Manila, 8,200 miles away. Refueling at mid-ocean bases built and supplied by Pan Am, the China Clipper makes the trip in just under 60 hours flying time. It is the first scheduled trans-Pacific flight. 4 years later, another new Pan Am plane, a Boeing B-314, is christened the Yankee Clipper. Another ocean, the Atlantic, and another Pan Am first. The Yankee Clipper leaves New York and flies to Lisbon, Portugal. The flight takes 26 hours. Shortly afterwards, Pan Am starts regular service between New York, England, and France. People marvel at the size and range and comfort of the new Clippers, with their dining rooms and elegant meal service and sleeping berths. Flying has never been this luxurious. Yet to Pan Am, they are just one more stage in a never-ending process of development. Says a Pan Am spokesman, these giant airplanes are actually the last of the little airplanes. There is a need for great ocean airliners, 2 to 3 times the size of these clippers.
An event of great importance was Boeing's production of the Model 247 10-passenger, low-wing, all-metal monoplane. This aircraft can claim to be the prototype of all modern airliners. It first flew on the 8th of February 1933. 60 of them were immediately bought by United, and they became that airline's standard equipment until 1936. The Boeing 247 made every other airliner seem obsolete. Unfortunately for the other airlines, the 247 wasn't available, as Boeing was part of the United Group. So, in response to this aircraft, TWA asked the Douglas Company to produce a competitive aircraft. This was the DC-1, which first flew in 1933. The DC-1 test plane was soon followed by the DC-2, which was the production variant. The DC-2 had a slightly longer cabin with room for 2 extra seats, carrying a total of 14 passengers in comfort. The basic design was considered ambitious and advanced for its day, but the aircraft proved to be reliable and efficient. Some 200 DC-2s were eventually built, and they proved popular with the airlines, so much so that there was soon a requirement for a larger version. Thus was launched one of the world's greatest aeroplanes. During the war, some 10,655 of these aircraft were produced as military versions. After the war ended, the surplus became available to civilian airlines, and in the post-war years, they were operated by just about every airline company. Even today, there are about 200 still in service throughout the world, more than 60 years after they were introduced. In 1936, an even larger version of the DC-3 was introduced, the DC-4, as was the Lockheed Electra and also the Boeing 307 Stratoliner. World War II brought about 3 major changes in air transport. One was the design and construction of higher capacity, long-range aircraft capable of transoceanic operation. The second was the construction of large-scale land airports throughout the world. And the third was the opening of worldwide operations by the US airlines, now dominating the world in airline travel. TWA began operating transatlantic services using the new Lockheed Constellation, which could carry as many as 81 passengers. The superior performance of the Constellation led Douglas to introduce the new DC-6 in many different variants for American Airlines and United Airlines. The DC-6 was then developed into the DC-7, which had more powerful engines and was longer than the DC-6. This aircraft was the first airliner capable of operating a transcontinental service in both directions without stops for refueling. There was one other large 4-engined airliner, the Boeing Stratocruiser. This aircraft was bigger than the other two and also had the added luxury of a lounge and a bar on a lower deck. Both Pan Am and BOAC operated these aircraft right up until jets were introduced. The first turbojet to enter service was the de Havilland Comet. This was followed by the Vickers-Armstrong Viscount. These were both flown by the recently formed British airline company BEA. In the USA, the first turbojet to make its maiden flight with a commercial airline was the Boeing 36780, which was in fact the prototype Boeing 707. Pan Am had placed the first orders for this new aircraft for their North Atlantic routes. The second US jet transport aircraft was the Douglas DC-8, which entered service with both United and Delta Airlines in September 1959. The British designer's break into the world of big jets, following the grounding of the Comets only a year after they entered service due to design faults, was the Vickers-Armstrong VC-10. The standard VC-10 could carry 139 passengers at a cruising speed of 580 miles per hour.
By 1960, the world's airlines had carried a total of 106 million passengers. Unbelievably, only 6 years later, this number had doubled. This rapid increase in traffic called for larger fleets of aircraft, and these added to airport and airway congestion. The answer to the problem was to build larger aircraft. The first of this new generation was seen in 1966, when Pan Am ordered 25 Boeing 747s, costing $21 million each.
The 747 was going to double the capacity, weight and power of the airliner in one step. Building the 747 jumbo jet broke new ground in aviation. Boeing had to construct a completely new giant factory north of Seattle. By 1967, Boeing were building the world's biggest jet in the world's biggest building ever constructed. Pan Am flew the original 747-100s in 1970. This aircraft had 58 first-class seats and 304 economy-class seats. The 747 underwent rapid development with increased power and higher weights. The first 747-200s were delivered to Lufthansa on the 9th of March 1972. The versatility of this aircraft was quite unique, as it could be used in a variety of roles, either as an all-passenger plane, or as a freighter, or as a combination of both. The next off the design boards was the 747-300, with a seating capacity for 538 passengers. This variant has a stretched upper deck, extending the fuselage by 23 feet. The final version is the Boeing 747-400. This model, the only one currently available from Boeing, is significantly different from the other variants. The wings are constructed of a much lighter aluminium-lithium alloy. The fuel tanks are larger, and on the flight deck, all of the instruments have been changed to multi-screen electronic displays. This enables 2 pilots to operate the 747, giving extra room for the now vacated flight engineer. This room has been taken up by a new flight crew rest area. This is significantly important because it allows space for the 2 additional pilots, which are needed on the ultra-long haul flights, such as between Sydney and Los Angeles. Built in 15 different variants, the Boeing 747's been the world's largest, heaviest and most powerful airliner for over 25 years. One airliner which never fails to attract public attention, even though it's been in service for over 25 years, is Concorde. This was the world's first, and now the world's only, supersonic transport in commercial service. The idea that an aircraft which could carry 100 passengers across the Atlantic in 3 hours at speeds faster than a rifle bullet had seemed inconceivable only a short time before. But on March the 2nd, 1969, it was to become a reality. Concorde 001 was ready for its first flight as it rolled out of the hangar. The world's press were gathered to see British test pilot Brian Trubshaw take the Concorde to the air for the very first time, marking the advent of a new age in airline history, the age of supersonic travel. The Tupolev Tu-144 made its first flight in 1968. Superficially, this aircraft resembled the Concorde, but its career, before ending abruptly, never equaled its rival, even after an extensive redesign. One of the early production aircraft broke up in mid-air in front of thousands of spectators at the 1973 Paris Air Show. Although a limited number of these aircraft had entered service, the type was eventually scrapped in 1978. The Concorde entered service in 1976 with British Airways and Air France. The high-speed transatlantic service provided by Concorde has proved indispensable for top business professionals, celebrities and dignitaries, allowing them to travel between London and New York in under 3.5 hours. This outstanding aircraft revolutionized air travel. For passengers have now entered the deep blue world only seen previously by test pilots and astronauts.